Hey there, my name is Marcus Rivera. I'm 34 years old, born and raised in San Antonio, Texas, but I've been stationed all over the world for the past 16 years. I'm a staff sergeant in the U.S. Army Special Forces, or what most folks call the Green Berets. My specialty? Counter-narcotics operations and jungle warfare training. I've served 4 tours across Latin America, 2 in Afghanistan, and more classified missions than I'm legally allowed to discuss. But let me tell you something that'll grab your attention right off the bat. On March 15th, 2024, I died for 18 minutes in the Venezuelan jungle. Not metaphorically, not almost died, I literally flatlined. No pulse, no brain activity, clinically dead. And what I saw during those 18 minutes changed everything I thought I knew about life, death, and the invisible war being fought over America's soul. See, most people think death is the end of the story. I'm here to tell you it's just the beginning of the most important chapter you'll ever experience. And what God showed me about our country, about the spiritual battle raging right now, about the role every soldier, every American plays in this cosmic conflict, it'll shake you to your core. I grew up in a military family. My father served in Desert Storm, my grandfather in Vietnam, and his father stormed the beaches of Normandy. Military service wasn't just a career choice in the Rivera household, it was a calling, a sacred duty. I enlisted straight out of high school, not because I didn't have other options, but because I felt this burning need to serve something greater than myself. Those early years molded me into what I thought was the perfect soldier, disciplined, emotionally controlled, tactically sharp. I could navigate any terrain, survive in hostile environments, and execute missions with surgical precision. But somewhere along the way, all that training, all that hardening, built walls around my heart that I didn't even know existed. Faith was always part of my upbringing. My mother dragged us to Mass every Sunday, and I went through all the Catholic traditions, First Communion, Confirmation, the whole 9 yards. But honest to God, it felt more like cultural ritual than spiritual connection. I believed in God the same way I believed in gravity, intellectually, without much emotional investment. When you're a Green Beret, your faith tends to be placed in your training, your equipment, your team. God becomes this distant figure you might pray to before a dangerous mission, more like calling in air support than having a conversation with your Creator. I had this relationship with the Almighty that was purely transactional. Keep me alive, help me complete the mission, and I'll try to be a decent human being. My wife, Sarah, bless her heart, she saw through all my tough guy armor from day one. We met during my 2nd deployment rotation when she was working as a nurse at Landstuhl Regional Medical Center in Germany. She was treating wounded soldiers, and I was recovering from shrapnel wounds I'd taken during a firefight in Afghanistan. She had this way of looking at you, like she could see straight through to your soul, past all the medals and the bravado to the scared kid underneath. We got married 3 years ago in a small ceremony back home in Texas. Sarah always said she could feel something missing in my spiritual life, like I was carrying around an empty holster where my real faith should be. She'd pray for me every night before I deployed, and I'd tolerate it more than embrace it. I thought her faith was beautiful, but impractical for someone in my line of work. The mission that changed everything started like any other. March 2024, we were conducting joint operations with Colombian forces along the Venezuelan border. Our objective was to disrupt a major drug trafficking route that was funneling narcotics into the United States and funding terrorist organizations across South America. Intelligence indicated a high-value target. A cartel leader with connections to hostile foreign governments was operating out of a compound deep in the Venezuelan jungle. This wasn't my first rodeo in that part of the world. I'd spent months training Colombian and Brazilian special forces in jungle warfare tactics. The terrain was brutal. Triple canopy rainforest, rivers that could kill you 6 different ways, and indigenous tribes that shoot first and ask questions never. but I knew that jungle like the back of my hand. Our team consisted of 8 Green Berets and 12 Colombian Special Forces operators. We inserted via helicopter at 0300 hours, about 20 clicks from the target compound. The plan was simple. Move through the jungle undetected, conduct surveillance for 48 hours, then execute a precision raid to capture the high-value target and extract intelligence. Everything went perfect for the first 36 hours. We moved like ghosts through that green hell, setting up observation posts, gathering intel, preparing for the assault. The compound was exactly where intelligence said it would be, and our target was confirmed on sight. We had clear fields of fire, multiple extraction routes, and complete tactical superiority. Then the world exploded. The explosion came without warning. 1 second I was adjusting my scope, getting ready to provide overwatch for the assault team, and the next second the earth opened up beneath me. Later I found out it was an old landmine from Venezuela's civil conflicts in the 90s. A Soviet-made PMN-2 that had been sitting dormant in the jungle floor for over 30 years, just waiting for the wrong footstep. The blast launched me 15 feet through the air and into a tree trunk that might as well have been a concrete wall. I felt my ribs crack, my left arm snap like a twig, and something warm and wet spreading across my chest. The ringing in my ears was so loud I couldn't hear my own team calling my name. Sergeant Martinez, our medic, reached me first. Through the haze and the pain, I could see his lips moving, but everything sounded like I was underwater. He was applying pressure to a wound in my chest, working frantically to establish an IV line, calling for immediate medical evacuation. The problem was, we were 48 hours deep in hostile territory, and the nearest trauma center was 200 miles away. I remember looking down at my chest and seeing more blood than any human being should be able to lose and still be conscious. The fragment from the landmine had punctured my left lung and nicked an artery. Martinez kept talking to me, trying to keep me alert, but I could feel myself slipping away like water running through a drain. "Stay with me, Sergeant Rivera," he kept saying. "Keep your eyes open, brother. Help is coming." But I knew. Soldiers develop an instinct about these things. I'd seen enough men die in combat to recognize the signs. The cold creeping up from my extremities, the way sound seemed to be getting farther and farther away. The strange sense of peace that settles over you when your body starts shutting down. The helicopter evacuation took 47 minutes. In combat medicine, we call it the golden hour. You've got 60 minutes from the time of injury to get a trauma victim to surgical care, or their chances of survival drop dramatically. By the time they loaded me onto that Black Hawk, I'd already used up most of my hour bleeding out in the Venezuelan jungle. I remember pieces of the flight, the vibration of the rotor blades, medics working over me, someone cutting away my gear and uniform, but mostly I remember this overwhelming sense of letting go, like I was a passenger in my own body and someone else had taken control of the vehicle. The helicopter landed at a forward operating base about 90 minutes after the explosion. I was unconscious by then, but later the flight medic told me my vitals crashed during transport. They performed 2 emergency resuscitations during the flight, shocking my heart back to life each time with the portable defibrillator. At the field hospital, they did everything they could. Emergency surgery to repair the punctured lung, massive blood transfusions, every life-saving technique in the military medical handbook. But my body had taken too much damage, lost too much blood. At 13:47 hours, 18 minutes after the medical team began their final resuscitation attempt, the cardiac monitor went flat. Dr. Rodriguez, the senior surgeon, called time of death at 13:47 hours. My heart had stopped, my brain activity was gone, and according to every medical instrument in that tent, Staff Sergeant Marcus Rivera had died in service to his country, another casualty of the war on drugs in South America. But that's when my real story began. I didn't experience the typical tunnel of light that you hear about in most near-death experiences. Instead, what happened was more like suddenly finding yourself in a place you'd been searching for your entire life without knowing it. One moment I was nothing, no consciousness, no awareness, no existence, and the next moment I was more alive than I'd ever been, standing in a realm that defied every law of physics I'd ever learned. The first thing I noticed wasn't what I saw, but what I felt. Love. Not the romantic love between a man and woman, or even the brotherly love you develop for your fellow soldiers. This was love as a fundamental force of the universe, like gravity or electromagnetic radiation, except it was personal and intimate and completely overwhelming. I was standing, though standing isn't really accurate since there was no ground beneath my feet, in what I can only describe as a space made of liquid light. It wasn't bright in a way that hurt your eyes. It was bright in a way that healed something deep in your soul that you didn't know was broken. The light had substance, warmth, intelligence. It was alive, and then I heard my name. Marcus. The voice came from everywhere and nowhere at the same time. It didn't enter through my ears because I'm not sure I even had ears in that place. It resonated directly into my consciousness, and every cell of my being, if I even had cells anymore, recognized the speaker immediately. Jesus. Not Jesus as depicted in church paintings or Hollywood movies. This was the Jesus of absolute authority and infinite tenderness, the creator of the universe wearing human form, light and love and truth made manifest. When I looked at him, I wasn't looking at a man who lived 2,000 years ago. I was looking at the eternal Son of God, the Word through whom all things were made, and he was looking back at me with complete knowledge of everything I'd ever done, thought, or dreamed. The fear that should have overwhelmed me simply wasn't there. In his presence, fear couldn't exist any more than darkness can exist in the middle of the sun. What I felt instead was recognition, like coming home after a deployment that had lasted my entire life. "You've been fighting the wrong war," he said, and somehow I understood that he wasn't just talking about Venezuela or Afghanistan or any physical battlefield I'd ever been on. When Jesus spoke those words, "You've been fighting the wrong war," it was like someone had suddenly given me spiritual night vision goggles. Everything I thought I understood about conflict, about good and evil, about the battles worth fighting, completely shifted into focus. He gestured, and suddenly we were looking down at Earth, but not the physical planet you'd see from space. This was the spiritual dimension of reality, the hidden battlefield where the real war has been raging since the beginning of time. What I saw took my breath away, if I even had breath in that place. Covering the United States like a dark storm system were these massive, writhing clouds of spiritual darkness. They moved with purpose, with intelligence, feeding off human emotions like parasites. Every act of hatred, every moment of division, every choice to choose pride over humility was like fuel being poured onto a fire. "Your nation is under siege," Jesus explained, "but most of your people can't see the enemy." I watched as these spiritual forces manipulated events in the physical realm. Political rallies became breeding grounds for spiritual poison. Social media platforms turned into weapons of mass distraction. Even churches, and this hurt to see, even churches were being infiltrated, their congregations divided not by theology, but by political allegiances that had nothing to do with the gospel. The most heartbreaking part was watching individual Americans going about their daily lives, completely unaware of the spiritual battles raging around them. I saw families torn apart not by legitimate disagreements, but by spiritual forces that fed on division. I watched neighbors who should have been friends turning into enemies over political differences, never realizing they were being played like pawns in a cosmic chess game. But then Jesus showed me something that changed everything. Scattered across the country, like stars in the darkness, were points of brilliant light. Each light represented someone who was praying, really praying, not just reciting words, but connecting their heart directly to the throne of God. And every one of those prayers was like a laser beam cutting through the spiritual darkness. This is your real mission now, Jesus told me. Not the war against drugs or terrorists or foreign enemies, the war for the soul of your nation. He showed me how prayer wasn't just a nice religious activity. It was literally the most powerful force in the universe. Every sincere prayer sent shockwaves through the spiritual realm, disrupting the plans of darkness, creating cracks in the enemy's strongholds. I watched as a grandmother praying in her kitchen in Ohio generated more real power than an entire armored division. "But why me?" I asked. "I'm just a soldier. I don't know anything about spiritual warfare." Jesus smiled, and his smile contained more warmth than every sunrise I'd ever seen. "You know more than you think. You understand sacrifice. You understand laying down your life for others. You understand following orders, even when you don't understand the mission. These are the qualifications I need." He began showing me specific things about America's future, and this is where the vision gets really intense. I saw two possible timelines stretching out from this moment in history, like two roads diverging in a forest. Down one path, I saw the United States tearing itself apart from within. Cities burning, brother fighting against brother, the Constitution shredded not by foreign enemies, but by our own hands. It was a civil war fought not just with bullets and bombs, but with ideas, ideologies, and spiritual forces that turned Americans into willing participants in their own destruction. The trigger points were all spiritual: pride, unforgiveness, the refusal to humble ourselves before God and seek His guidance. I watched as political leaders on both sides of the aisle became puppets dancing to strings, pulled by spiritual forces they couldn't even see. The tragedy wasn't just the physical destruction. It was watching the greatest experiment in human freedom collapse because we forgot the spiritual foundation it was built on. But the other path was glorious. Down that road, I saw what Jesus called the Great Awakening. It started small, with individual Americans falling to their knees in genuine repentance, not for political reasons, but from a deep spiritual hunger for truth. It spread like wildfire through communities, bringing healing to racial divisions, restoration to broken families, and unity across political lines that had seemed impossible to bridge. I watched as churches stopped arguing about politics and started praying for transformation. I saw business leaders and government officials making decisions based on biblical principles rather than partisan loyalty. Most amazingly, I witnessed a generation of young Americans discovering their spiritual heritage and taking up the mantle of prayer warriors. "The choice isn't up to me," Jesus explained. "It's up to your people. But they need to understand what's really at stake." Then he showed me something that nearly broke my heart: the spiritual condition of America's military. I saw soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines serving around the world, most of them completely unaware that they were fighting symptoms while the real disease went untreated back home. I watched as some of our finest warriors returned from overseas deployments only to lose hope because they couldn't understand why the battles never seemed to end, why evil kept spreading despite all their sacrifices. They need to understand their true calling, Jesus said, not just as warriors for democracy, but as spiritual guardians of a nation called to be a light to the world. He showed me how every military member had been specifically chosen and positioned by God for this moment in history. Their training in discipline, sacrifice, and courage made them uniquely qualified to lead in the spiritual battle ahead. But first, they needed to see the battlefield clearly. The vision intensified as Jesus pulled back the curtain on something that shook me to my core: the spiritual infiltration of America's military. What I saw made every physical enemy I'd ever faced seem insignificant by comparison. Dark spiritual entities were systematically targeting our service members, not trying to kill their bodies, but to destroy their souls. These weren't demons with horns and pitchforks like in movies. They were sophisticated, intelligent beings that understood human psychology better than most therapists. I watched as these forces worked to isolate soldiers returning from deployment, whispering lies about their worth, their purpose, their hope for the future. The suicide epidemic among veterans wasn't just a mental health crisis. It was spiritual warfare of the highest order, designed to eliminate some of God's most powerful potential warriors before they could understand their true calling. They attack your military first, Jesus explained, because warriors who discover their spiritual authority become unstoppable forces for my kingdom. He showed me how every veteran struggling with PTSD, every soldier battling addiction, every Marine questioning whether their service mattered, they were all casualties in a war they didn't know they were fighting. The enemy's strategy was brilliant and evil. Use the very experiences that should have made them stronger to convince them they were broken beyond repair. But then Jesus revealed the counter-strategy, and it was beautiful. When my warriors wake up to who they really are, he said, the tide of battle turns completely. I witnessed spiritual awakenings happening in VFW halls, military bases, and veteran support groups across the country. Tough soldiers and Marines who'd never shown emotion breaking down in tears as they encountered the love of God for the first time. Former Special Operations warriors discovering that their real mission had just begun. Not fighting human enemies, but teaching others how to engage in spiritual warfare through prayer, worship, and surrender to Christ. The transformation was incredible. Veterans who'd been written off as hopeless cases becoming powerful ministers and prayer warriors. Military families that had been struggling with deployment stress, finding supernatural peace through genuine faith. Entire military communities being transformed as God's love healed wounds that no amount of therapy or medication had been able to touch. Jesus showed me specific military leaders, generals, admirals, senior enlisted personnel who were being prepared by God to lead this spiritual awakening. Some of them didn't even know they were Christians yet, but God was orchestrating events in their lives to bring them to a point of surrender and transformation. Your testimony will be one of the sparks that ignites this awakening, Jesus told me. But you must be willing to speak the truth, even when it's uncomfortable, even when it challenges everything the military culture has taught you about strength and independence. Then the vision shifted to show me the global implications of America's spiritual condition. I saw how the entire world was watching, waiting to see if the United States would remember its spiritual heritage or continue sliding into darkness. Countries that had once looked to America as a beacon of freedom and hope were losing faith in our leadership. Not because of our military weakness. Our armed forces were still the most powerful on earth, but because we'd lost the spiritual authority that made our power meaningful. A nation that forgets God loses the right to lead other nations to God, Jesus explained. Without spiritual foundation, all your military might become just another form of oppression. I witnessed the ripple effects of America's spiritual decline affecting Christians in persecuted countries around the world. Believers facing imprisonment and death in places like North Korea, Iran, and China were praying for America's church to wake up and lead by example. Their faith was stronger than ours, but they understood that when America was spiritually strong, it created space for the gospel to spread globally. The responsibility was overwhelming. The spiritual health of America wasn't just about Americans. It was about God's plan for reaching every nation on earth. But Jesus wasn't finished with me yet. The most intense part of the vision was still to come. Now I want to show you your personal mission, he said. And suddenly we were back in that Venezuelan jungle where my body lay dying. I could see the medical team working frantically over my physical form, Dr. Rodriguez performing chest compressions while the other medics prepared to call time of death. My teammates were gathered around, some of them praying, others just standing in shocked silence as they watched their sergeant's life slip away. "You have a choice," Jesus told me. "You can stay here with me. Your tour of duty is complete. Your service has been honorable, and heaven is your reward. Or you can go back and fight the most important battle of your life." The choice should have been easy. The peace, the love, the perfect understanding I was experiencing in his presence made every earthly pleasure seem like a cheap imitation. Why would anyone choose to return to a world full of pain, conflict, and spiritual darkness? But as I looked down at my team, at the medics fighting to save my life, at my fellow soldiers who were going to have to continue fighting without understanding the real enemy they faced, I felt a burden I'd never experienced before. "They don't know," I whispered. "They're fighting so hard, sacrificing so much, and they don't even know what the real battle is." Jesus nodded. "That's why you have to go back. Not as the same man who stepped on that landmine, but as a warrior who's seen behind the veil. Your mission now is to help my people understand that the weapons of their warfare are not carnal, but mighty through God to the pulling down of strongholds." The weight of it hit me. He was asking me to give up paradise, to return to a broken world, and try to convince hardened military professionals that their real enemy was spiritual, that their most powerful weapons were prayer and worship, that the key to victory wasn't better tactics or superior firepower, but humble surrender to the will of God. "I don't know how to do that," I admitted. "I barely knew how to pray before this happened." "I'll teach you," Jesus promised, "and I'll send others to help you. But Marcus, you have to understand, this mission is voluntary. You can choose to stay, and no one will judge you for it. Your service has already earned you a place here." As I stood there in the presence of Jesus, weighing the most important decision of my existence, something shifted inside me. It wasn't logic or duty or even courage. It was love. Love for my country, love for my fellow warriors, love for a generation of Americans who were fighting battles they couldn't win because they couldn't see the real enemy. "I'll go back," I told him, "but I'm going to need your help every step of the way." Jesus smiled, and his smile contained all the authority of heaven and all the tenderness of a father watching his child take their first steps into destiny. "You'll never fight alone again," he promised. "And Marcus, when you tell this story, don't worry about who believes you. Your job is to plant seeds. I'll take care of the harvest." The transition back to my physical body was unlike anything I can describe. Imagine being a drop of water that had joined the ocean, experiencing the vastness and power of the whole, then suddenly being forced back into the confines of a single drop. That's the closest analogy I can give for what it felt like to return from the spiritual realm to the limitations of flesh and blood. My heart started beating at exactly 1405 hours, 18 minutes after Dr. Rodriguez had called time of death. The cardiac monitor's flat line suddenly spiked into a strong, steady rhythm. My eyes opened, and the first words out of my mouth were, "I have to tell them." The medical team thought I was delirious. They'd seen cases before where patients experienced hallucinations during near-death events, usually caused by oxygen deprivation to the brain. Dr. Rodriguez later told me that in his 15 years of military medicine, he'd never seen someone come back after 18 minutes of clinical death with no neurological damage. "It was medically impossible," he said. "We don't have an explanation for what happened to you." But I knew. God had given me a supernatural resurrection to authenticate the message I was carrying. The recovery process was unlike anything the medical textbooks describe. Within 24 hours, I was alert and coherent. Within 48 hours, I was walking around the hospital. The fragments that had punctured my lung had somehow shifted position during my death, and the internal bleeding had mysteriously stopped. Even the bone fractures in my left arm were healing at an accelerated rate. More importantly, my spiritual awareness had been permanently altered. I could sense things, spiritual atmospheres, the presence of God, the activity of demonic forces that had been completely invisible to me before. It was like someone had given me spiritual X-ray vision. During my medical leave, I spent hours in prayer and Bible study, trying to understand everything Jesus had shown me. Sarah noticed the change in me immediately. The hardened soldier she'd married was still there, but now there was a depth of peace and spiritual authority that hadn't existed before. "You're different," she told me one evening as we sat on our back porch in Texas. "Not just the near-death experience. You're different in your spirit." I told her everything, every detail of the vision, every word Jesus had spoken, every image of America's spiritual condition that had been burned into my memory. Sarah wept as I described the two possible futures for our country, and then she did something that confirmed I was on the right track. "I've been praying for our nation's military for years," she said. "Not just for their physical safety, but for God to raise up spiritual warriors who could see beyond the physical battles. Marcus, I think you're an answer to those prayers." When my medical leave ended, I made a decision that shocked my entire chain of command. I requested transfer to a chaplain assistant position and began the process of pursuing theological education. My commanding officer thought I'd suffered some kind of psychological trauma from the near-death experience. "Rivera, you're one of the best operators we have," Colonel Harrison told me. "This chaplain thing, it's not going to satisfy someone with your skill set. You're a warrior, not a preacher." "Sir, with respect," I replied, "I'm discovering that real warfare is spiritual. Everything else is just shadow boxing." The transition wasn't easy. Military culture doesn't make much room for mystical experiences or dramatic spiritual transformations. Most of my fellow soldiers were supportive but skeptical. They'd seen me as a solid, dependable operator, and now I was talking about visions and spiritual warfare and the need for America to repent. But God began confirming the message through supernatural events. Soldiers I prayed for experienced instantaneous healings from injuries that should have required months of physical therapy. Veterans struggling with PTSD found complete peace through encounters with God that happened during our prayer sessions. Family relationships that had been destroyed by deployment stress were supernaturally restored. Word began to spread through the military community about the Green Beret who died in Venezuela and come back with a message from Jesus. I started receiving invitations to speak at military chapels, veterans groups, and prayer gatherings across the country. The message was always the same: America is in a spiritual battle for its soul, and our military personnel are being specifically called by God to lead the fight through prayer, worship, and surrender to Christ. The enemy isn't ultimately political or ideological, it's spiritual, and it can only be defeated through spiritual weapons. Some audiences received the message with hunger and desperation, recognizing the truth of what they were hearing. Others dismissed it as the ravings of a soldier who'd suffered brain damage from his injuries. But in every setting, something supernatural happened when I shared my testimony. People began seeing visions during my presentations. Hardened soldiers broke down in tears as they encountered the love of God for the first time. Entire military units experienced spontaneous revivals that transformed their morale and effectiveness. The most powerful responses came from veterans who'd been struggling with purposelessness after their military service ended. When they understood that their real mission was just beginning, that God wanted to use their warrior training for spiritual battles, everything changed. Suicide rates plummeted in units where spiritual awakening took hold. Divorce rates dropped. Addiction recovery skyrocketed, but the vision Jesus had shown me was bigger than individual transformations. He'd told me that America stood at a crossroads, and the choice we made would determine not just our national destiny, but our role in God's global plan. As I travel and speak, I can see the evidence of both possible futures playing out simultaneously across the country. In some regions, spiritual darkness is gaining ground, dividing communities and destroying hope. In others, genuine revival is breaking out, bringing racial reconciliation, political unity, and supernatural peace. The outcome isn't predetermined. It depends on whether God's people, especially those He's called to be warriors, will humble themselves, pray, seek His face, and turn from their wicked ways. That's why I'm sharing this story with you today. Not because I want fame or recognition, but because Jesus specifically told me that my testimony would be one of the sparks that ignites a spiritual awakening among America's military and veteran community. If you're serving in uniform right now, if you're a veteran trying to find your purpose after military service, if you're the family member of someone in the armed forces, God has a specific calling on your life that goes far beyond your military occupation. You've been trained for discipline, sacrifice, and courage, not just to fight America's physical enemies, but to lead the spiritual battle for our nation's soul. The time for playing games with God is over. The time for casual Christianity and cultural religion has passed. America needs warriors who understand that our real enemy is spiritual, and our most powerful weapons are prayer, worship, and complete surrender to the will of God. I died in a Venezuelan jungle and came back to tell you, the battle for America's future will be won or lost in the spiritual realm. And God is calling His military warriors to lead the charge. The question is, are you ready to answer that call?